I was organizing my project files when Tony walked over to my desk. His face was unreadable, but something in his eyes made my stomach twist. "Pack up your things, Karen," he said flatly. "You're moving." I blinked, confused. "Moving where?" He pointed across the room to a cramped desk near the supply closet. "You're being demoted. Brian's taking over your position, your desk, and your responsibilities. Effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. 5 years. I'd given this company 5 years, working my way up from assistant to senior analyst. I'd sacrificed weekends, worked through holidays, stayed late countless nights. And now this. Brian, Tony's favorite who made constant mistakes, was replacing me? I opened my mouth to protest, but Tony was already walking away. "Have it cleared by end of day," he called over his shoulder. I stood frozen, watching Brian smirk from across the room. He'd been eyeing my desk for months. This wasn't about performance. This was about favoritism. Tony had made his choice, and apparently I wasn't it. My hands trembled as I reached for an empty box. This was humiliating. But as I started packing, something inside me hardened. Tony had no idea what he'd just started. I didn't argue with Tony. What was the point? He'd clearly made up his mind without consulting me, without warning, without any explanation beyond his blunt announcement. My co-workers watched in uncomfortable silence as I loaded my belongings into a cardboard box. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked questions. They just stared at their computer screens, pretending they didn't see what was happening right in front of them. I felt invisible, erased. The new desk Tony had assigned me was in the worst location in the entire office. It was tucked in a corner far from the windows, next to the noisy copy machine and the supply closet. It was where they put people they wanted to forget about. As I set my box down on the dusty surface, I fought back tears. I refused to cry. I refused to give Tony and Brian the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Instead, I took a deep breath and made a decision right there. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to fade away. I was going to make them regret this decision. I just needed to be smart about it. I needed a plan. My name is Karen Cooper, and this is what happened to me. The rest of that afternoon felt like torture. I sat at my new desk, staring at the blank walls around me. From this corner, I had a perfect view of Brian settling into my old spot by the window. He looked so pleased with himself, leaning back in my chair, adjusting my desk lamp. Tony walked by and clapped him on the shoulder, congratulating him like he'd actually earned something. My blood boiled watching them. This wasn't about merit or performance. This was pure favoritism. Tony had decided months ago that Brian was his golden boy, and nothing I did would change that. I'd watched Tony cover for Brian's mistakes for 2 years now. Every time Brian screwed up a report or missed a deadline, Tony found excuses. Meanwhile, I'd been carrying half the department's workload without complaint, without recognition. Brian caught my eye and gave me a little wave. The smugness on his face was unbearable. I looked away, clenching my jaw. They thought I was beaten. They thought I'd just accept this demotion and disappear into my corner. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. I had 5 years of documentation, 5 years of proof that I was valuable. And I was going to use every bit of it. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and my laptop open on the coffee table. I wasn't going to storm into Tony's office tomorrow demanding answers or making threats. That would just make me look emotional and irrational. No, I was going to play the long game. I was going to be strategic. I created a new folder on my computer and labeled it simply, Evidence. Then I started compiling everything I could find. Emails showing projects I'd successfully led. Performance reviews where Tony himself had praised my work and called me invaluable to the team. Messages where he'd thanked me for fixing Brian's mistakes. Screenshots of reports I'd completed. Client testimonials. Every piece of documentation that proved my worth to the company. I had 5 years of material and I was going to organize all of it. My plan was simple but would require patience. I would keep my head down at work, continue doing excellent work, and let Tony and Brian think I'd accepted defeat. Meanwhile, I'd quietly build an airtight case documenting my value. When the time was right, I'd present everything to the right people. Tony thought he could push me aside without consequences. Brian thought he'd stolen my career. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But before I continue with what happened next, if you are enjoying this story, please like and share. The next few weeks were almost unbearable. Tony barely acknowledged my existence anymore. When he did speak to me, it was only to assign me basic tasks that were far beneath my skill level. Data entry, filing, scheduling meetings. Work that any entry-level assistant could handle. It was degrading. Meanwhile, Brian was drowning in the responsibilities he'd taken from me. I watched him struggle with the quarterly reports that I used to complete effortlessly. He'd come in early and stay late, staring at spreadsheets with a confused expression on his face. He had no idea what he was doing. Part of me wanted to help him. After all, his failure would reflect badly on the entire department. But a bigger part of me wanted to watch him crash and burn on his own. I chose to observe and document. During team meetings, I stayed quiet in the back of the room, taking careful notes on every mistake Brian made. He'd present data that was incomplete or outright wrong, and Tony would scramble to make excuses for him. "He's still learning the systems," Tony would say with forced confidence. "Give him some time to adjust." But Marcus, our department head, was starting to notice the decline in quality. I could see the disappointment in his face during presentations. One afternoon, I went to the break room to refill my coffee. I was about to enter when I heard voices inside, Tony and Brian talking. I stopped just outside the doorway when I heard my name mentioned. "I honestly can't believe Karen just took the demotion without any fight," Tony was saying. "She's completely given up. I thought she'd at least argue about it." Brian laughed, but it sounded uncertain. "I don't know, Tony. Don't underestimate her. I've worked with Karen for 2 years. She's stubborn as hell. This quiet acceptance doesn't feel right to me." Tony snorted dismissively. "She knows she can't win. Why would she fight a battle that's already over? She's smart enough to know when she's beaten." Their words stung deeply, but they also ignited something fierce inside me. They thought I was weak. They thought I'd surrendered. They had no idea that my silence was strategic, not defeated. Brian was right to be suspicious, but Tony was too arrogant to listen. I took a breath and walked into the break room like I hadn't heard a single word. "Good afternoon," I said cheerfully, pouring my coffee with steady hands. Tony looked slightly uncomfortable, but Brian just nodded at me. As I left, I heard Tony whisper, "See? She's completely fine with everything." I smiled to myself as I walked back to my corner desk. Let them think that. Let them get comfortable in their victory. They had no idea what was coming. I started volunteering for extra projects, specifically the ones nobody else wanted to touch. There was a massive backlog of data analysis that had been sitting incomplete for months because it was tedious, time-consuming, and frankly boring. When I offered to take it on, Tony looked surprised but didn't question my motivation. He probably assumed I was desperately trying to prove I still had value. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. I worked on those projects during evenings and weekends, making sure every single detail was absolutely perfect. I didn't just complete the work. I exceeded every expectation. I found patterns in the data that nobody else had noticed. I identified cost-saving opportunities. I created clear, comprehensive reports that anyone could understand. And I documented everything meticulously. Every hour I worked. Every problem I identified. Every solution I implemented. This wasn't just busy work anymore. This was evidence that I was still the most valuable analyst in the department, regardless of what my official job title said. Meanwhile, Brian continued to struggle visibly. The quarterly report deadline was approaching fast, and I could see the panic building in his eyes every day. He'd been working on it for weeks and it still wasn't anywhere near ready. I knew because I'd seen drafts he'd accidentally left on the shared printer. The numbers didn't match up. The analysis was superficial and poorly reasoned. His conclusions were flat out wrong. It was almost painful to watch. Almost. 2 weeks before the quarterly report was due to be submitted to the executive team, Brian made his first catastrophic mistake. He sent an email to the entire department with his preliminary findings. The problem was his findings were completely, embarrassingly wrong. He'd somehow mixed up 2 completely different data sets and drawn conclusions that made absolutely no sense to anyone with basic analytical skills. Within an hour of that email going out, Marcus called an emergency team meeting. Everyone filed into the conference room looking confused and concerned. Tony tried desperately to cover for Brian, saying it was just an early draft and not meant for wide distribution. But Marcus wasn't accepting excuses. "This report goes directly to the executive team," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. We cannot afford amateur mistakes like this. Tony, I thought you said Brian was ready for this level of responsibility. Tony's face flushed red with embarrassment. He is ready. This was just an unfortunate oversight. It won't happen again. Marcus turned his attention to me. Karen, you handled these quarterly reports for 3 years without a single problem. How long would it take you to fix this mess? Everyone in the room turned to stare at me. I could feel Brian's anxious glare and Tony's uncomfortable tension. I kept my expression carefully neutral and professional. About 3 days of focused work, sir, I answered calmly. But Brian's already invested significant time in this project. I'm sure with proper guidance he can correct his own mistakes. Marcus shook his head firmly. We don't have time for training and guidance right now. I need this report fixed immediately and I need it done right. That evening I stayed late at the office to clean up Brian's disaster. The building was empty except for the distant sounds of the cleaning crew working on the lower floors. The silence was almost peaceful as I pulled up all the files Brian had been struggling with for weeks. When I opened his work, I felt a mixture of vindication and genuine exhaustion. This report should have been mine from the very beginning. I worked steadily for hours, correcting countless errors, completely reorganizing the data structure, and rebuilding the entire analysis from scratch. By midnight, the quarterly report was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. It was the caliber of work I'd been producing consistently for 5 years. The kind of thorough, insightful analysis that had made our department successful and respected. I saved everything carefully, making sure my name was clearly visible in all the file metadata. Then I sent a complete copy to my personal email for my records. Finally, I left the corrected version on the shared company drive with a simple note attached. Quarterly report revised and corrected. Ready for executive review. KW. I knew Marcus would see it first thing in the morning. The next day Tony called me into his office. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact as I sat down across from him. Marcus was very impressed with the work you did last night, he said stiffly, like the words physically hurt him. Thank you for stepping in to help the team. I smiled politely, keeping my voice pleasant and professional. Of course. Just doing my job, Tony. He dismissed me quickly after that, but I could clearly see the cracks forming in his confident facade. His golden boy had failed spectacularly, and everyone knew who had saved the situation. The following week brought another critical project, this one even more important than the quarterly report. It was major client-facing work that could potentially make or break our company's relationship with one of our largest and most valuable accounts. The project was worth millions in annual revenue. Tony assigned it directly to Brian, probably trying to give him a chance to redeem himself and prove he deserved the promotion. I watched Brian's confidence completely crumble in real time as he began to understand the scope and complexity of what he'd been given. He spent the first 3 entire days just trying to understand the basic requirements and parameters of the project. Then he missed the crucial initial planning meeting with the client because he'd somehow written down the wrong time in his calendar. When he did finally meet with them, he sent a follow-up email with their company's names spelled incorrectly. These were small mistakes individually, but together they painted a picture of incompetence. My coworkers definitely noticed. I overheard conversations by the water cooler and in the break room. Why on earth did Tony give this project to Brian? Someone asked with obvious concern. Karen always handled all our client accounts flawlessly. Office politics, another person replied knowingly. But it's going to blow up badly and we'll all suffer for it. I said nothing during these conversations, but internally I completely agreed with their assessment. This project was going to be Brian's ultimate downfall, and he was managing it entirely on his own. All I had to do was wait patiently and let him fail without any interference from me. The truth would reveal itself. I was returning from my lunch break when I heard raised, angry voices coming from Tony's office. The door was partially open and I immediately recognized Brian's frustrated tone. I slowed my pace, listening carefully. She's deliberately making me look bad, Brian was saying, his voice tight with accusation. Every single time I turn around, Karen's fixed something I did and everyone in the office notices and compares us. Tony sighed heavily, sounding exhausted. Brian, you need to focus on your own work and stop worrying about what Karen's doing. That's not productive. But everyone's constantly comparing us. They're all talking about how much better things were when she had my position. Even Marcus made comments about it yesterday. Marcus doesn't make personnel decisions for this department. I do. And I chose you for very specific reasons that I don't need to justify. There was a long, heavy pause before Brian spoke again, his voice quieter and uncertain. But Tony, maybe you were wrong. Maybe I'm really not ready for this level of responsibility after all. I actually stopped breathing when I heard those words. Was Brian seriously admitting that he couldn't handle the job? Was he finally recognizing his own limitations? Don't talk like that, Tony said firmly, but I could hear the worry underneath his authoritative tone. You're doing fine. Karen's just desperately trying to stay relevant and visible. She's trying to make herself feel important. Just ignore her. I walked away quickly before they could catch me eavesdropping, but my heart was racing with excitement. Tony had staked his entire reputation on Brian's success, and now even Brian himself was doubting whether he was capable. This was developing even better than I'd hoped. The pressure was building and cracks were appearing everywhere. That afternoon my desk phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID showed it was someone from the Human Resources Department. My stomach immediately dropped with anxiety. Was I being fired? Had Tony complained about me? Had I done something wrong? I answered with a shaky voice. This is Karen. Hi Karen, this is Pamela from Human Resources. Do you have a few minutes to come down to my office? I'd like to discuss something with you. My mind raced through terrible possibilities. I forced myself to sound calm. Of course, Pamela. I'll be right there. I walked to the HR floor with sweaty palms and a racing heart. Pamela greeted me with a genuinely warm smile and gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. Please don't worry, she said immediately, clearly reading my anxious expression. You're not in any kind of trouble at all. We're conducting our routine annual performance reviews, and I noticed some significant discrepancies in your personnel file that I'd like to understand better. Discrepancies? What did that mean? She opened a thick folder on her desk. My employee file. According to all our records, you've consistently received excellent performance reviews since you started here. You've successfully led several major projects. Your supervisors have repeatedly praised your work quality. However, your recent demotion doesn't align with any documented performance issues whatsoever. There's no warning, no improvement plan, nothing. Can you help me understand what happened? This was it. This was the moment I'd been quietly preparing for. I chose my words very carefully, keeping my tone professional and factual. I was informed by Tony that Brian would be taking over my position and all my responsibilities. He said it was effective immediately. I wasn't given any specific reason for the decision, and no performance concerns were ever mentioned to me beforehand. Pamela took detailed notes, her expression remaining neutral but clearly focused and attentive. Pamela asked me many more specific questions about the circumstances of my demotion. She wanted to know exactly how it was communicated to me, whether I'd received any kind of advance warning, whether there had been any documentation or formal meetings. I answered every question honestly and completely, carefully keeping my emotions in check and presenting just the facts. She asked detailed questions about my current workload and responsibilities. I mentioned the various projects I'd been taking on, including the fact that I'd stayed late to completely fix Brian's catastrophically flawed quarterly report. So you're still performing senior-level analytical work, she said slowly, just without the corresponding title or appropriate compensation? I nodded confirmation. I want to contribute meaningfully to the team's success regardless of my official title. She made several more notes, then looked up at me with a serious expression. Karen, I'm going to be completely honest with you. What you're describing doesn't look right at all. This company takes fair treatment of employees very seriously, and sudden demotions without proper cause or documentation are a significant red flag for us. My heart jumped with hope, but I kept my face calm and professional. I appreciate you taking the time to look into this situation. I'll need to review everything with my team and conduct interviews with Tony and others. This investigation may take several weeks to complete properly. In the meantime, please document any additional concerns or issues that arise. You can email me directly anytime. I left her office feeling physically lighter than I had in weeks. Sure was officially paying attention now. The wheels of justice were finally turning in my favor. Someone in authority was finally seeing the truth of what had happened to me. I'd been patient, I'd documented everything, and now it was starting to pay off. Word apparently spread very quickly through the office that HR was conducting some kind of investigation. I didn't say anything to anyone about my meeting with Pamela, but somehow people knew something significant was happening. Tony must have been called in for questioning because his entire demeanor changed dramatically overnight. He became defensive and irritable, snapping at people over tiny things that normally wouldn't bother him. He completely avoided looking at me or speaking to me directly. Brian seemed confused and worried, constantly asking Tony quiet questions that I couldn't quite hear. The office atmosphere grew noticeably tense and uncomfortable. People whispered in corners and small groups. I caught coworkers glancing back and forth between Tony, Brian, and me, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. Everyone sensed something big was going on, but nobody knew the specific details. I deliberately kept my head down and continued working diligently. I volunteered for yet another abandoned project that had been languishing incomplete. I organized our department's completely chaotic shared file system. I even helped a frustrated coworker troubleshoot a complex technical problem with their software. I made absolutely certain that everyone could clearly see I was a dedicated team player who contributed meaningfully regardless of my title or recognition. Marcus, our department head, stopped by my desk one afternoon unexpectedly. "Karen, I wanted to personally thank you for your excellent work on the quarterly report," he said. "It was outstanding as always." I smiled warmly. "Thank you, sir. I'm truly happy to help wherever I'm needed." He nodded slowly, studying my face. "I've noticed that about you. Your dedication and professionalism haven't gone unnoticed, despite everything." Then he walked away, leaving me with a genuine spark of hope growing in my chest. Things were definitely changing. 3 weeks after my initial meeting with Pamela, Tony was called into a conference room for a meeting with HR representatives and members of upper management. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Tony gesturing defensively and speaking rapidly while Pamela and another HR representative took extensive notes. When he finally emerged, his face was pale and his jaw was clenched tight. He walked directly to his office and shut the door firmly behind him without speaking to anyone. Brian tried to follow him to ask questions, but Tony actually waved him away dismissively. Later that afternoon, an official email went out from the HR department announcing a comprehensive departmental review of personnel decisions and management practices. It was carefully worded corporate language, but everyone understood what it really meant. They were investigating Tony's decisions and leadership. My coworkers looked at me with new understanding and sympathy. They'd figured out that I'd somehow triggered this investigation. Several people approached me quietly throughout the day, sharing their own stories of Tony's favoritism, his unfair treatment of various employees, and his questionable management decisions over the years. One woman told me she'd been passed over for promotion 3 times while less qualified men who were friends with Tony got the positions instead. Another person mentioned how Tony had once blamed her publicly for a major mistake that was actually Brian's fault. I listened carefully to their stories and took mental notes, but I didn't encourage gossip or complaining. I simply thanked them for sharing their experiences and returned to my work. The tide was definitely shifting now and I could feel the momentum building. Truth and fairness were finally starting to win. 4 weeks into HR's formal investigation, Marcus called an unexpected mandatory department meeting. Tony looked absolutely miserable, sitting alone in the corner while Marcus stood at the front of the conference room. Everyone filed in quietly, sensing this was going to be important. "I want to address some significant changes that will be taking place in our department structure," Marcus began seriously. "Effective immediately, we're restructuring several roles and redistributing responsibilities to better align with individual employees' demonstrated strengths and actual performance records." He looked directly at me. "Karen, you'll be leading our new client services team. You'll have 2 direct reports working under you, and you'll have full authority over all the department's client-facing projects and relationships." I blinked, struggling to process what he'd just said. Leading a team? Having direct reports? That was actually higher than my original position before the demotion. Tony's face turned bright red, but he didn't say a single word. Brian was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Marcus continued speaking. "Brian will be moving to a support analyst role under Karen's direct supervision. He'll focus on data entry and basic analysis tasks until he develops the advanced skills needed for more complex work. The conference room was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Marcus kept going. Tony will remain as department manager, but his authority over personnel decisions will now require my direct approval going forward. We're implementing new oversight procedures and checks to ensure fair and appropriate treatment of all employees based on merit and performance. I caught Pamela's eye across the room. She gave me a small, knowing nod of acknowledgement. This was only the beginning of the changes, but it was a powerful start. Justice was finally being served. After the meeting ended, several of my coworkers quietly congratulated me. Some looked genuinely relieved, like justice had finally been served after a long wait. Others seemed nervous, probably worried about how Tony might react or whether there would be retaliation. Tony himself didn't speak to me for the entire rest of that day. He stayed locked in his office with the door closed, and when he finally emerged late in the afternoon, he grabbed his coat and left without saying goodbye to anyone. Brian approached my desk hesitantly around 4 o'clock. He looked genuinely uncomfortable and remorseful. "Karen, I wanted to say that I'm truly sorry. For everything that happened. For all of this." I looked up at him, studying his face. His previous arrogance and smugness were completely gone, replaced by what seemed like genuine regret and humility. "I knew Tony was playing favorites with me," he continued. "I knew it wasn't really fair. But I convinced myself that I actually deserved the promotion in your position. I didn't fully realize how much complex work you were actually handling or how badly I was screwing everything up until it was too late." I genuinely appreciated his honesty, even though it was coming far too late to undo the damage. "Thank you for saying that, Brian. I do appreciate it. We'll be working together going forward, and I'm committed to helping you develop your skills properly. But you absolutely need to be willing to learn, ask questions, and admit when you need help." He nodded quickly and earnestly. "I will. I promise I'll do better." As he walked away, I felt a strange, complicated mixture of vindication and exhaustion washing over me. I'd won this battle, but it had cost me months of stress, humiliation, and emotional pain. Still, I'd proven an important point. Merit and competence matter more than favoritism and politics. Eventually, the truth comes out. The following week, HR's comprehensive final report was released to upper management. I wasn't given access to all the specific details, but the results and consequences were absolutely clear to everyone. Tony received a formal written reprimand for biased personnel decisions and inappropriate favoritism. He was required to attend mandatory management training courses and would remain on probationary status for 6 months. Any future personnel decisions he wanted to make had to be submitted for approval by both Marcus and HR before implementation. Brian's promotion was officially reversed in all company records, and my demotion was completely removed from my personnel file as if it had never happened. I received full back pay for the 2 months I'd spent in the lower position, plus a formal written apology from the company. More importantly, my new leadership role came with a significant salary increase and the professional respect I'd been unfairly denied for months. Tony tried desperately to save face by acting like nothing significant had happened, but absolutely everyone knew the truth. His reputation was permanently damaged and his authority was severely limited. He'd gambled everything on Brian and lost catastrophically. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the office. The favoritism that Tony thought would secure his legacy and prove his judgment had instead completely exposed his poor decision-making and nearly destroyed his entire career. Meanwhile, I was the one left standing strong, vindicated, and promoted. His attempt to push me aside and diminish me had backfired spectacularly in ways he never could have imagined. I'd been patient, strategic, and ultimately successful. The truth had won. My new team officially started the following Monday morning. I had 2 direct reports. Both were sharp, capable, hard-working people who'd been consistently overlooked and undervalued by Tony, just like I had been for so long. We immediately hit the ground running, tackling the significant backlog of client projects that had piled up during Brian's brief and disastrous tenure in my former role. The difference in quality and efficiency was immediately obvious to everyone. Projects were completed on time and exceeded client expectations. Clients who'd been frustrated were suddenly happy again. The department's professional reputation began recovering quickly. Marcus stopped by regularly to check on our team's progress, And each time he seemed increasingly impressed with our results. "This is exactly what I expected and hoped for when I approved this restructure," he told me during one of his visits. "You're exactly where you should have been all along, Karen. I'm sorry it took so long." I also made good on my sincere promise to help Brian develop his skills properly. He was genuinely humble now, actually listening carefully and taking detailed notes during our training sessions and meetings. He'd never be a top-tier performer, but with proper guidance and realistic expectations, he could become competent and reliable. Tony watched all of this unfold from his office, visibly diminished and distant. He rarely spoke up in meetings anymore, and when he occasionally did, people barely listened to him. He'd completely lost their respect and trust, and he clearly knew it. His authority was gone. Sometimes I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I'd remember how easily and casually he'd dismissed me, how he'd humiliated me in front of the entire office without a second thought. He'd made his choices deliberately, and now he was living with the consequences. He'd earned every bit of this. My personal life improved dramatically as well. The crushing stress and anxiety that had been suffocating me for months finally lifted completely. I slept better at night. I smiled more easily. I had energy for my hobbies again. My friends and family immediately noticed the positive change in my demeanor and attitude. My sister called me one evening, her voice full of excitement and relief. "You sound like yourself again. I was so incredibly worried about you during all that horrible drama at work." "I'm good now," I told her honestly. "Better than good, actually. I fought for myself and what I deserved, and I won." She laughed warmly. "I'm so proud of you. You could have just quit and walked away to find a new job, but instead you stood your ground and fought." He was absolutely right. Quitting would have been easier in many ways. It would have been the path of least resistance. But if I'd done that, Tony would have won completely. He would have successfully pushed me out and moved on without facing any consequences for his actions. Instead, I'd forced the company to see clearly what they were losing. I'd made them acknowledge the truth and fix the injustice. That was worth far more than any new job at a different company could have been. I'd proven something crucial to myself. I didn't need to be the loudest person in the room or the most aggressive to win. I just needed to be undeniably excellent at what I did and patient enough to let the truth eventually come to light. Sometimes quiet competence and strategic patience speak louder than anything else possibly could. As the weeks turned into months, my team's success became absolutely undeniable to everyone. We'd brought in 2 significant new major clients and successfully renewed contracts with 3 existing clients who'd been seriously considering leaving due to poor service during Brian's time in charge. Marcus presented our impressive results to the executive leadership team, and I was personally invited to attend the meeting to discuss our strategies and approach. It was the kind of high-level visibility I'd never gotten under Tony's management. After the presentation concluded, the CEO himself stopped me in the hallway outside the conference room. "Karen, Marcus has spoken very highly of your leadership and results. We're extremely glad to have you in this role. You're exactly what this department needed." It was a simple compliment, but it meant absolutely everything to me. I'd gone from being demoted and dismissed to being personally recognized and praised by the highest level of company leadership. That night, I treated myself to dinner at my favorite restaurant. I sat alone by the window, watching the city lights twinkle, and reflected deeply on the entire journey. The demotion had been absolutely devastating and humiliating at the time. But looking back now, I could see that it had forced me to fight for my worth in a way I'd never had to do before. I'd discovered inner strength and resilience I didn't even know I possessed. And I'd learned an invaluable lesson that would stay with me forever. Never, ever let anyone else define your value or worth. You know what you're capable of. Stand up for yourself. Tony tried several times to reconnect with me and rebuild some kind of working relationship after everything settled down. He'd stop by my desk with forced casual conversation or send friendly emails about team-building activities. I was consistently polite but maintained clear distance. I hadn't forgotten what he'd done to me, and I wasn't remotely interested in pretending everything was fine now. One day he specifically asked if we could grab coffee together and talk privately. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what he possibly wanted to say. We sat in the coffee shop on the ground floor of our building, and Tony looked visibly uncomfortable, fidgeting with his cup. "I owe you a real apology, Karen," he began awkwardly. "I made a terrible decision that I deeply regret." I let my personal biases completely cloud my professional judgment. You deserved so much better than how I treated you. I appreciated hearing the words, but they felt somewhat hollow and too late. Why did you do it, Tony? Was I really that easy for you to just throw away? He sighed heavily. I genuinely thought Brian had potential and I wanted to give him a real opportunity to prove himself. But I was completely wrong about his readiness, and I was wrong to sacrifice your career for my misguided experiment. I'm truly sorry. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Thank you for finally saying that. But a simple apology doesn't undo all the damage you caused. I had to fight for months just to get back what should have been mine all along. He looked down at his coffee cup. I know. And I'll have to live with that knowledge. We finished our coffee in awkward silence, and I never accepted any of his subsequent invitations. Some things can't be fixed with just words. Brian continued steadily improving under my patient guidance and training, but he never regained the cocky confidence he'd displayed before everything fell apart. He was competent now, reliable even, but he clearly knew he'd been given an opportunity he hadn't truly earned and had failed spectacularly and publicly. He worked hard consistently to prove himself and rebuild trust, and I genuinely respected his effort and humility. One afternoon he asked if we could talk privately in one of the small conference rooms. I wanted you to know that I'm actively looking for positions at other companies, he said quietly. I think it's honestly best if I start completely fresh somewhere else. This place will always remind me of my mistakes and failures. I understood completely. I think that's probably a wise decision for you, Brian. You've learned valuable lessons here and you'll definitely do better in your next role because of everything you've experienced. He nodded gratefully. Thank you for not completely giving up on me. You could have made things so much harder than you did. You had every right to. I don't believe in punishing people forever for their mistakes, I said honestly. You acknowledged what happened, you apologized sincerely, and you worked hard to improve. That's more than a lot of people do. 2 weeks later, Brian officially gave his notice. Tony looked genuinely relieved when he heard. I think they were both ready to move on from the whole uncomfortable situation. And honestly, so was I. It was time to close this chapter completely. A year after my demotion, Marcus was promoted to VP of Operations. In his farewell speech to our department, he mentioned the importance of recognizing talent and fighting for fair treatment. I've learned that the best leaders don't play favorites. They elevate everyone and let merit decide who rises, he said, looking directly at me. Karen's team is a perfect example of what happens when you put the right people in the right roles. After he left, I was offered his position as department head. It was a massive promotion. 2 levels above where I'd started and 3 levels above where Tony had tried to push me. The interview process was rigorous, but I was ready. I'd proven myself over and over again. When they offered me the job, I accepted immediately. Tony remained as a manager under my leadership, which was perhaps the ultimate irony. He reported to me now, the woman he'd once demoted, without a second thought. To his credit, he handled it professionally, even if it must have been humbling. I didn't gloat or make things difficult for him. I simply expected the same high standards from him that I expected from everyone else. Standing in my new office, the corner office with windows overlooking the city, I reflected on everything that had happened. A year ago, I'd been packing up my desk in humiliation, convinced my career was over. Now I was leading the entire department, respected by colleagues and executives alike. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, patience, and the importance of documenting your worth. I'd learned that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud protests, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply being undeniably excellent at what you did. Tony had tried to erase me, but instead he'd pushed me to prove exactly how valuable I was. His favoritism had backfired spectacularly, costing him his reputation and his authority. Meanwhile, I'd emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever. I looked at the photo on my desk. Me receiving my department head promotion, shaking hands with the CEO. It reminded me that no one could take my worth away from me. They could only fail to recognize it. And when they did, I'd fight to make sure the truth came to light. Because I deserved to be here. And I'd proven it, one quiet victory at a time.